In the spring of 1847, a woman stood at the window of a Louisiana plantation house and made a decision that would corrupt 3 lives forever. Her husband, a man of wealth and standing, carried a secret that threatened to destroy everything they had built. He was incapable of fathering children, a fact confirmed by 3 different physicians and hidden behind closed doors through 7 years of manufactured excuses and delayed explanations. But Eleanor Beaumont was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was a woman who understood that power, real power, meant being willing to do what others found unthinkable. And so she looked out across the grounds of Bellerive Plantation, past the formal gardens and the cotton fields, toward the quarters where the enslaved lived, and she began to plan. The secret she would create would be protected by fear, maintained through lies, and buried so deep that even the child at the center of it would believe the fiction. For 15 years that child would grow up thinking he knew who he was, where he came from, what blood ran in his veins. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would shatter not just one boy's understanding of himself, but the carefully constructed illusions of an entire family. This is the story of how far desperation will drive the powerful, how completely silence can be purchased when you own the people around you, and how a single act of deception can echo across decades, destroying everyone it touches. Bellerive Plantation sprawled across 4,000 acres of Louisiana bottomland, 30 miles upriver from New Orleans. The main house was a testament to French colonial architecture, white columns supporting wide galleries, tall windows designed to catch every whisper of breeze in the suffocating summer heat. The property had been in the Beaumont family for 3 generations. Built on the labor of enslaved people whose numbers had grown to nearly 200 by the time Eleanor married into the family in 1840. Eleanor came from Mobile society, the daughter of a shipping merchant who had made his fortune in the cotton trade. She brought a dowry of $30,000 and connections that expanded the Beaumont family's commercial reach. She was 23 when she married Thomas Beaumont, 29, heir to Bellerive and everything it represented. The marriage was celebrated as a perfect union of wealth and refinement, 2 families strengthening their position through strategic alliance. What no one outside the immediate family knew was that Thomas carried a defect that made that alliance fundamentally unstable. Thomas had contracted mumps as a young man, a childhood disease that arrived late and hit hard. The fever had lasted for weeks, and when it finally broke, it left behind damage that couldn't be seen but could be measured. 3 separate physicians, consulted in secrecy over the years, had delivered the same diagnosis. Thomas was sterile. His body simply could not generate the seed necessary for creating children. It was a devastating verdict for a man whose entire identity rested on the idea of founding a dynasty, of passing Bellerive to his sons and securing the family's future for generations to come. For 7 years, Thomas and Eleanor had hidden this truth behind excuses. They claimed Eleanor needed time to adjust to the climate, that the heat and humidity of Louisiana were difficult for someone raised in Mobile. They suggested that stress from managing the plantation was affecting their ability to conceive. They consulted physicians publicly about Eleanor's health, deflecting attention from the real source of their childlessness. But by 1847, society's patience was wearing thin. Thomas's younger brother had already produced 3 healthy sons, and the whispers had begun. Perhaps the plantation should pass to someone capable of continuing the line. Perhaps Thomas's branch of the family had reached its natural end. Eleanor understood what those whispers meant. Without children, she would eventually be set aside, her position reduced, her influence diminished. The property she had expected to help manage, the legacy she had married into, would slip away to her husband's brother's family. She would become an afterthought, pied perhaps, but ultimately irrelevant. The prospect filled her with a cold rage that she had learned to hide behind perfect manners and gracious smiles. She had not married into one of Louisiana's finest families to become a footnote in someone else's story. The solution came to her gradually, emerging from observations and calculations that she barely acknowledged even to herself at first. She began to study the enslaved men who worked the plantation, paying attention to their features, their builds, their mannerisms. She observed them with the same calculating eye she might use when selecting breeding stock, evaluating them for characteristics that might pass for Thomas's own. And eventually, her attention settled on a man named Marcus. Marcus was 28 years old, owned by the Beaumonts since childhood, when his mother had been purchased from a Virginia estate. He worked as a carpenter, one of the skilled craftsmen who maintained the plantation's buildings and constructed the furniture for the main house. He was tall, well-built, with features that showed the mixed ancestry common among enslaved people, but refined enough that Eleanor thought they might, with the right framing, be explained as resembling some distant Beaumont relation. His skin was light brown, several shades darker than white, but not so dark that a child of mixed parentage would be immediately obvious. More importantly, Marcus was intelligent, educated enough to read and do figures, useful qualities that meant he was kept close to the main house and had learned to move through white spaces without drawing attention. Eleanor began to engineer situations that would put her in contact with Marcus. She requested repairs in parts of the house where she could observe him working. She consulted with him about furniture designs, asking questions that required extended conversations. She studied the way he moved, the way he spoke, searching for anything that might later betray a child's true parentage. And gradually, as spring turned to summer, she began to formulate a plan so audacious that she barely believed she was considering it. Before we continue with Eleanor's plan and the impossible choice she presented to both her husband and to Marcus, subscribe to The Sealed Room and hit that notification bell. We uncover the darkest secrets buried in America's past, the stories too disturbing for traditional history books. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe, and we love knowing where our fellow truth seekers are located. Now let's discover what Eleanor was willing to do to secure her position. The conversation took place in late July, on an evening when the heat hung over Bellerive like a physical presence, making even breathing feel like labor. Eleanor had sent the house servants away on fabricated errands, ensuring complete privacy. Thomas sat in his study, a glass of whiskey already half empty, his face showing the strain of 7 years spent maintaining a lie. Eleanor stood by the window, backlit by the dying sun. Her silhouette sharp against the fading light, she explained her plan methodically, without emotion, framing it as she had learned to frame everything with Thomas, as a practical solution to a practical problem. They needed an heir. Thomas couldn't provide one. But the world didn't need to know that. What if they could produce a child who appeared to be Thomas's, who could be raised as the legitimate Beaumont heir, who could inherit everything without anyone questioning the circumstances? All it would require was finding the right father, ensuring absolute secrecy, and maintaining the fiction perfectly until it became indistinguishable from truth. Thomas's first response was horror, then anger, then a kind of desperate fascination. He understood immediately what Eleanor was proposing and what it would require. The use of an enslaved man to father a child that would be claimed as white, as legitimate, as heir to one of Louisiana's most prominent plantations. It was a violation of every social code he had been raised to uphold, a mixing of blood that the law explicitly forbade, a deception so profound that discovery would mean absolute ruin. But it was also a solution to the problem that had been slowly destroying him for 7 years. Eleanor had prepared her arguments carefully. She reminded Thomas of what they stood to lose, painting vivid pictures of his brother's children inheriting Bellerive, of them becoming irrelevant in their own family story. She appealed to his pride, his sense of entitlement, his deep belief that he deserved to found a dynasty, regardless of his body's betrayal. And she presented the practical details that showed she had thought through every obstacle. The enslaved man she had selected, Marcus, was light-skinned enough that a child might pass scrutiny. They could stage a pregnancy, limit visitors, control the narrative completely. They could ensure silence through the power they held over everyone involved. And the child would never know, raised from birth to believe Thomas was his father and Eleanor his mother. The conversation lasted until dawn. Thomas raised every objection he could think of, moral, practical, social, and Eleanor had answers for all of them. She had spent months preparing for this discussion, anticipating every argument, constructing responses that would move Thomas from rejection to consideration to reluctant acceptance. By the time the sun rose over the Louisiana Delta, turning the river to gold, Thomas had agreed to every detail of his wife's plan. The implementation required approaching Marcus, and that task fell to Eleanor. She summoned him to the main house on an August afternoon when Thomas was in New Orleans on business. Marcus arrived expecting to discuss some repair work, perhaps a new commission for furniture. Instead, he found Eleanor waiting in the parlor. The door closed, the window shuttered against both heat and prying eyes. Eleanor explained what she wanted with the same calculating directness she had used with Thomas, but with an added element that Marcus understood immediately. This was not a request. She held absolute power over him, over his life, over his future, over everything. If he refused, she could have him sold away from the only home he'd ever known, separated from his family, sent to one of the brutal sugar plantations where enslaved people died within years from the grinding labor. If he cooperated, she promised better treatment, easier work, protection for his family. But the real message, the one that didn't need to be spoken aloud, was simpler. He had no choice. Enslaved people never had choices when it came to their owners' desires. Marcus stood silent as Eleanor spoke, his face carefully neutral, showing none of the revulsion and terror he felt. He understood what she was describing, understood that she intended to use his body to create a child that would be raised as white, that would inherit wealth built on the enslavement of people who shared his blood. He understood that he would be forced into intimacy with this woman, that the act would be framed as duty rather than rape, though the power dynamics made it exactly that. And he understood that his silence would be purchased through threats and promises, that he would be expected to watch his own child grow up believing a lie, never knowing his real father. Eleanor gave him one night to consider, though they both knew consideration was a fiction. The next evening, Marcus returned to the main house and indicated his acceptance with a single nod. He couldn't bring himself to speak the words aloud, couldn't verbally consent to something that wasn't truly consensual. Eleanor seemed to understand. She simply nodded back and explained when he should return, how they would proceed, how absolute secrecy would be maintained. What followed over the next 3 months was a grotesque choreography of scheduled encounters and manufactured privacy. Marcus would be summoned to the main house on specific evenings, always when Thomas was conveniently absent. He would be brought to Eleanor's private chambers through the back stairs, where the regular house servants were forbidden from going. The acts themselves were clinical, stripped of anything resembling genuine intimacy, both parties desperately trying to separate their minds from what their bodies were being forced to do. Marcus learned to arrive, fulfill his required purpose, and leave without meeting Eleanor's eyes, without speaking beyond the minimum necessary words. Eleanor treated it as she might treat any unpleasant but necessary task, something to be endured and completed efficiently. By November, Eleanor was certain she was pregnant. The timing had worked as she'd calculated, and her body showed the unmistakable signs. She immediately began the performance that would convince Louisiana society this child was Thomas's. She announced her condition with appropriate joy and modesty. She began dressing in ways that would later allow her to pad her figure as the pregnancy supposedly progressed. She made a show of consulting with physicians, though always with Thomas present to control the narrative. And she ensured that Marcus was reassigned to work on a distant part of the plantation, removed from the main house entirely, his role in creating the child she carried already being erased. The months of Eleanor's pregnancy were a masterclass in controlled deception. She understood that every detail mattered, that a single inconsistency could unravel everything. She carefully calibrated her supposed symptoms, complaining of morning sickness and fatigue in the right measure, neither so dramatic as to seem theatrical, nor so mild as to seem suspicious. She adjusted her clothing gradually, adding padding beneath her dresses in increments that mimicked natural growth. She limited social engagements with excuses about the delicate nature of her condition, reducing the number of people who could observe her closely. And she studied pregnant women obsessively, noting how they moved, how they held themselves, mimicking the physical adjustments that came with carrying a child. Thomas played his role with surprising effectiveness. His relief at having a solution to their crisis translated into genuine-seeming pride and excitement. He spoke of the coming heir with the enthusiasm of a man whose future had been secured. He accepted congratulations from other planters with appropriate humility mixed with satisfaction. And he joined Eleanor in limiting visitors to Bellerive, framing it as concern for his wife's health, but really ensuring that fewer people would witness the deception up close. The couple became increasingly isolated during those months, cocooned in their lie, bound together by shared guilt and desperate necessity. Marcus, meanwhile, existed in a state of numb dissociation. He had been moved to supervise timber cutting in the furthest reaches of the plantation, work that kept him away from the main house for weeks at a time. When he did return to the central compound, he was forbidden from coming anywhere near Eleanor. The few enslaved people who suspected what had happened understood through bitter experience that speaking of it would mean death or worse. Marcus's mother, who had worked in the main house for decades and understood more than she wished to, watched her son with silent grief, knowing he carried a burden that would poison his entire life. She couldn't protect him, couldn't ease his suffering, could only witness it from a distance and add it to the accumulated weight of horrors she had endured across 40 years of enslavement. Spring arrived with its explosion of heat and growth, and Eleanor began the final phase of her performance. She announced that her confinement was approaching, that she would need complete privacy for the birth. She had a small cottage on the grounds prepared, separate from the main house, equipped with everything necessary for delivery but positioned to prevent casual observation. She dismissed the regular midwife and instead sent Thomas to New Orleans to hire someone who had no connection to the plantation, who wouldn't know Eleanor hadn't actually been pregnant, who could be paid enough to ensure discretion. The midwife Thomas returned with was a free woman of color named Josephine, experienced in difficult births and accustomed to working with white families who valued privacy. She was told that Mrs. Beaumont had particular anxieties about childbirth, that she required isolation and absolute confidentiality. Josephine understood without needing elaborate explanations that white families had secrets they paid to protect. She asked no questions beyond those necessary for the medical aspects of her work. She would attend the birth, ensure mother and child survived, collect her substantial fee, and forget she had ever been to Bellerive. That was the transaction, simple and clear. Eleanor went into her theatrical confinement in mid-May, moving to the cottage with great ceremony. Only Josephine and one elderly enslaved woman named Ruth, chosen for her loyalty and her failing eyesight, were permitted to attend her. Thomas remained in the main house, pacing and drinking, playing the role of anxious father while actually terrified that some element of the plan would collapse at this crucial moment. And Marcus was brought back from the timber cruise, not to the main house but to a cabin near the cottage, kept close but hidden, waiting for a birth that would create his child and simultaneously erase him from that child's life forever. The birth itself was quick, almost anticlimactic given the months of elaborate preparation. Eleanor went into labor on a Tuesday morning, delivered by early afternoon, and by evening was resting with a healthy infant boy in her arms. The child emerged with light brown skin, darker than white but not definitively black, his features undefined in the way of all newborns. Josephine cleaned him, checked him for problems, pronounced him healthy and strong, then left the cottage to inform Thomas that he had a son. Marcus, waiting in the cabin, heard the baby's first cries through the walls and felt something break inside him that would never fully heal. Eleanor held the child for those first hours with a complex mixture of emotions she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't her baby, not in any biological sense, yet she had carried the deception of him for 9 months. She had planned for him, shaped her entire future around him, committed acts she could never undo to bring him into existence. And now he was here, real and breathing and dependent, looking at her with unfocused eyes that would eventually see her as mother, never knowing the truth. She felt triumph that her plan had worked, anxiety about maintaining the deception, and something uncomfortably close to tenderness for this small creature who represented her salvation. Marcus was allowed to see the baby once, a brief visit orchestrated by Ruth, who felt some vestige of mercy for a father being denied his child. He stood in the cottage doorway for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at the infant who carried his blood, his features, half of his very existence. The baby was wrapped in fine linen, lying in a cradle of polished wood that Marcus himself had built weeks earlier, not knowing then it was for his own son. He wanted to hold the child, to touch him, to mark this moment somehow so that later, when the lies had completely buried the truth, he would have at least this memory. But Eleanor was watching, and Ruth was anxious, and the moment passed. Marcus nodded once, turned, and walked back to his cabin, where he remained for 2 days, unable to work, unable to eat, unable to reconcile what had been done to him with any framework that allowed him to continue living. Thomas came to the cottage that evening and met his supposed son with a performance of paternal pride that would have been touching if it hadn't been built on complete fabrication. He held the baby with awkward tenderness, studied his features for resemblance he could later claim to see, and made all the appropriate sounds of wonder and satisfaction. To Eleanor's relief, the baby's skin was light enough to be explained away. Mixed-race children's coloring could vary dramatically, and this child fell into an ambiguous range that might be attributed to Mediterranean ancestry or simply a tendency to tan. His features were soft and unremarkable, nothing that immediately shouted his mixed heritage. With careful management and strategic framing, Thomas could claim him as his own without obvious contradiction. The formal announcement came 3 days later. Thomas sent word throughout the parish and to New Orleans that Eleanor had been safely delivered of a son, to be named Henry Thomas Beaumont, heir to Bellerive Plantation. Visitors began arriving within the week, bearing gifts and congratulations, eager to see the newest addition to one of Louisiana's prominent families. Eleanor received them in the main house, having moved back from the cottage with appropriate ceremony, playing the part of new mother with skill that came from months of preparation. She was tired but glowing, proud but modest, everything a respectable woman should be after fulfilling her primary duty of producing an heir. The baby was presented to visitors with careful staging. Eleanor ensured the viewing happened in rooms with specific lighting, at times of day when the infant's skin appeared at its lightest. She dressed him in elaborate clothing that framed his face but covered most of his body. She limited how long anyone could hold him, claiming anxiety about his health and fragility. And she watched each visitor's face carefully for signs of suspicion or recognition, ready to deploy explanations and deflections if questions arose. But no questions came. Society was predisposed to accept the narrative presented by people of the Beaumont standing. To question a baby's parentage would be to insult the family, to suggest moral corruption and racial mixing that polite people didn't acknowledge, even when it was obvious. So the visitors cooed over Henry, remarked on his beauty, claimed to see Thomas's eyes or Eleanor's mouth, and departed satisfied that Bellerive's succession was secured. Marcus was sent back to the timber crews immediately after the birth, removed from the plantation center as completely as possible. Eleanor wanted no chance of him being seen near the baby, no possibility that someone might notice a resemblance or observe an inappropriate emotional response. He was to be erased from Henry's life before that life even truly began. But erasure, Eleanor would discover, was more complicated than simple physical distance. Marcus remained on the plantation, remained alive and working and existing as a constant potential threat to her carefully constructed fiction. The first year of Henry's life passed in a state of controlled anxiety for Eleanor. She devoted herself to motherhood with an intensity that surprised even her, not just as performance but as genuine investment in this child she had gone to such lengths to obtain. She nursed him herself rather than hiring a wet nurse, partly to avoid questions about her body's ability to produce milk and partly because she found unexpected satisfaction in the intimacy of feeding him. She kept him close constantly, monitoring his development with obsessive attention, watching for any sign that might betray his true parentage. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, his features began to define themselves more clearly. His skin remained lighter than Eleanor had feared, darkening slightly with sun exposure, but staying within a range that could be explained without reference to African ancestry. His hair had a slight wave to it that worried Eleanor initially, but Thomas dismissed her concern, pointing out that his own grandmother had been Italian and contributed curl to the family's gene pool. Henry's nose was broad, his lips full, but these features in isolation could be attributed to individual variation rather than racial mixing. He was, in short, ambiguous enough to pass, especially with the protective framing of wealth and position. Thomas grew genuinely attached to the boy, his initial performance of fatherly pride transforming into something more authentic. He had spent 7 years grieving the children he could never have, and now here was Henry, laughing and learning and calling him Papa. The guilt Thomas felt about the circumstances of Henry's conception began to fade. Buried under the daily reality of raising a child who felt like his own, he taught Henry to ride, to recognize good horseflesh, to understand the basics of cotton cultivation. He read to him from agricultural journals and family histories, preparing him to eventually inherit Bellerive and continue the Beaumont legacy. And if late at night Thomas sometimes remembered how Henry had actually come to exist, he pushed those thoughts away with practiced determination, focusing instead on the future he was building. Eleanor watched Henry's relationship with Thomas with complex emotions. She was relieved that Thomas loved the boy, that her plan had secured not just an heir, but apparently a genuine family structure. But she also felt a strange possessiveness, a sense that Henry was hers in ways Thomas couldn't fully understand. She had conceived the plan, arranged every detail, ensured its success through willpower and calculated ruthlessness. Henry's existence was her achievement, her victory over the biological limitations that had threatened to destroy her position. Thomas might believe he was Henry's father, might play that role convincingly, but Eleanor knew the truth. Henry was the child of her determination, her willingness to do what others found unthinkable. The enslaved community at Bellerive watched Henry's childhood with carefully hidden knowledge. They knew what the white family refused to acknowledge. They recognized Marcus's features in the boy's face, saw the resemblance in his gestures and expressions. They understood that Henry was one of them, stolen and raised as white, taught to believe he was superior to the very people whose blood ran in his veins. Some felt anger at the deception, at the cruelty of raising a black child to become a master of enslaved people. Others felt profound sadness for Marcus, forced to watch his son grow up calling another man father. And many felt a complex mixture of both, recognizing the tragedy while understanding the impossibility of any different outcome. Marcus himself had aged years in the months following Henry's birth. He worked with mechanical efficiency, fulfilling his duties but showing none of the pride or engagement he'd once brought to his carpentry. His mother watched him with breaking heart, seeing her son being consumed by grief and rage he couldn't express. She tried to talk to him, to offer what comfort she could, but Marcus had retreated to a place beyond words. He had been violated, used, and then forced to witness the ongoing consequences of that violation as his child was raised to despise everything Marcus was. There was no framework, no philosophy, no faith that could make such a situation bearable. He simply endured it because enslaved people had no choice but to endure. If you're finding this story as deeply disturbing as it is compelling, hit that like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. The psychological horror of this situation, the way power corrupts every relationship it touches, reveals something fundamental about the plantation system that comfortable history often hides. Let's continue with what happens as Henry approaches his teenage years, and the carefully maintained lies begin to show cracks. By the time Henry turned 12, he had grown into a boy who showed every sign of becoming exactly what Eleanor and Thomas had tried to create. A refined young gentleman prepared to inherit one of Louisiana's finest plantations. He was tall for his age, athletic and confident, educated by private tutors in Latin, mathematics, literature, and history. He could ride as well as any adult, shoot accurately, and discuss cotton prices and cultivation techniques with impressive sophistication. He moved through Bellerive with the easy authority of someone who had never doubted his place in the world, never questioned his right to command, never imagined he might be anything other than what he appeared to be. But cracks were beginning to show in the elaborate fiction. Eleanor noticed them first, small inconsistencies that most people would overlook but that filled her with creeping dread. Henry's skin had darkened slightly as he spent more time outdoors, taking on a golden brown tone that was just ambiguous enough to be explained but noticeable enough to occasionally prompt questions. His hair, which had seemed merely wavy as a child, had developed more pronounced curl as he aged, requiring pomade and careful grooming to maintain acceptable appearance. And his features, while still individually attributable to European ancestry, had collectively begun to suggest something more complex, a mixture that observant eyes might recognize if they looked too closely or questioned too seriously. More concerning were Henry's emerging personality traits. He showed an uncomfortable empathy for the enslaved people at Bellerive, asking questions about their lives and treatment that made both Eleanor and Thomas uneasy. He had befriended several of the enslaved children who worked around the main house, treating them with a familiarity that violated proper social boundaries. When Thomas punished slaves for infractions, Henry sometimes protested the severity, arguing for mercy in ways that seemed to Thomas dangerously soft. Eleanor worried that these tendencies suggested something deeper, some instinctive recognition of kinship that Henry couldn't consciously articulate, but that manifested in his behavior. The real crisis began in the summer of 1862, when Henry was 15 years old and the war between the states had transformed everything about plantation life. Federal forces were advancing through Louisiana, and Bellerive existed in a state of anxious uncertainty. Thomas had aged badly over the previous year, the stress of protecting the plantation from both Union troops and Confederate requisitions weighing heavily on him. His health was failing, his drinking had increased, and the careful control he'd once maintained over every aspect of Bellerive was slipping. It was in this atmosphere of crisis and uncertainty that Henry stumbled across the first real evidence of his true origins. The discovery came not through any deliberate investigation, but through simple chance, the kind of accident that Eleanor had spent 15 years trying to prevent. Thomas had taken ill in late July, confined to bed with what the doctor called nervous exhaustion, but what everyone recognized as the combined effects of alcohol and overwhelming stress. Eleanor spent most of her time nursing him, leaving Henry to manage much of the daily plantation operations under the overseer's guidance. One afternoon, searching Thomas's study for documents related to a cotton shipment, Henry found a locked drawer in his father's desk. The lock was old and poorly maintained, and Henry had watched Thomas open it enough times to understand the mechanism. He told himself he was looking for business papers, that he had legitimate reasons to access whatever his father kept secured. But even as he worked the lock open, he felt the guilty thrill of transgression, the sense that he was about to discover something he wasn't meant to know. Inside the drawer were personal papers, letters and documents that had nothing to do with plantation business. Henry almost closed it immediately, respecting his father's privacy, but one envelope caught his attention. It was addressed to Thomas in a woman's handwriting, postmarked from New Orleans, dated March 1848, just months before Henry's birth. The letter inside was from the midwife, Josephine, and its contents made Henry's hands begin to shake. The letter was carefully worded, oblique in its references, but its meaning was clear enough to someone reading with attention. Josephine acknowledged receipt of final payment for her services. She confirmed that she would maintain complete discretion regarding the unusual circumstances of the birth. She noted that the arrangement had been successfully concluded and that all parties should feel secure that their privacy was protected. She included a reminder that certain aspects of the situation, if revealed, would be damaging to all involved, and reassured Thomas that her financial interest in silence was permanent. Henry read the letter 3 times, his mind trying to construct innocent explanations for phrases that seemed to resist innocent interpretation. What unusual circumstances? What arrangement? What aspects would be damaging if revealed? He wanted to dismiss his growing suspicions as imagination, as misunderstanding, but the letter's carefully coded language suggested secrets too significant to ignore. He began searching through the other papers in the drawer with more purpose now, less concerned about violating privacy than about finding answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate. He found receipts for payments to Josephine that seemed excessive for a normal birth, amounts suggesting purchase of silence rather than simple medical services. He found a letter from a New Orleans physician confirming what appeared to be a diagnosis of sterility, addressed to Thomas and dated 1843, 5 years before Henry's birth. And he found a brief note in Eleanor's handwriting, undated but clearly old from the yellowing paper, that simply read, "The carpenter's work is complete. We must ensure he never comes near the house again." The carpenter. Henry's mind immediately went to Marcus, the enslaved carpenter who had worked at Bellerive for as long as Henry could remember, but who had always been kept at a distance from the main house, assigned to remote projects and maintenance work that kept him away from the family. Henry had occasionally noticed Marcus watching him from afar, had caught him staring with an expression that seemed like more than ordinary deference or curiosity. Now those observations took on new and terrifying significance. Henry returned the papers to the drawer with shaking hands, reset the lock, and left the study in a state of shock so profound he could barely walk straight. His mind was racing, connecting fragments of observation and memory into a pattern that his conscious thoughts desperately wanted to reject. His father was sterile. His mother had arranged something with a carpenter. A midwife had been paid for discretion about unusual circumstances. And he, Henry, had features that had sometimes prompted questions. coloring that had required explanations, characteristics that set him slightly apart from his parents. The implications were impossible, unthinkable, a violation of every law and custom he had been raised to believe in. But they were also beginning to feel horribly, unavoidably true. For 2 days, Henry moved through his routines like a ghost, mechanically performing his duties while his mind churned with questions he couldn't ask aloud. He watched his parents with new eyes, searching their faces for signs of the deception he suspected. He studied Eleanor's interactions with him, noting a quality of anxious watchfulness he had always attributed to maternal concern, but that now seemed more like the vigilance of someone guarding a dangerous secret. He observed Thomas's affection for him, genuine and warm, and wondered how his father could love him while maintaining such a profound lie. And he found himself thinking about Marcus, the carpenter who had somehow completed work that required him to be kept away from the house forever after. Henry had seen Marcus occasionally over the years, a tall, dignified man who worked with quiet efficiency and kept to himself. Now Henry tried to remember Marcus's features in detail, tried to compare them to his own reflection. The exercise was torture, forcing him to examine his own face for evidence of what he most feared to discover, searching for resemblances that would confirm the horrible suspicion taking root in his mind. On the 3rd day, Henry made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He would confront Marcus directly, would ask the questions no one else seemed willing to answer. He waited until evening, when the enslaved workers had returned from the fields and the overseers had retired for the night. Then he walked out to the quarters, to the small, well-maintained cabin where Marcus lived alone, and knocked on the door with a hand that trembled despite his efforts to steady it. Marcus opened the door and froze when he saw who stood outside. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the man who might be father and the boy who might be son, separated by 15 years of enforced silence. Marcus's face showed a rapid succession of emotions. Shock, fear, something that might have been hope, then a terrible resignation. He glanced around quickly, checking if anyone had seen Henry come to his cabin, then stepped aside to let the boy enter. The cabin was sparse but immaculately kept, showing the same attention to craftsmanship that Marcus brought to his carpentry work. A single chair, a narrow bed, a small table with a Bible, and a few tools laid out in precise order. Marcus gestured for Henry to sit, but Henry remained standing, too agitated to settle. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that couldn't be said, shouldn't be acknowledged, but that filled the small space like smoke. "I found letters," Henry finally said, his voice cracking on the words. "In my father's desk. Letters that imply." He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't speak aloud the accusation that would change everything. Marcus's face showed no surprise, only a deep weariness that made him look much older than his 43 years. He walked to the small table, picked up the Bible, held it for a moment as if drawing strength from its weight, then set it down again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Your mama, Mrs. Eleanor, she needed a child. Your daddy, Mr. Thomas, he couldn't give her one. And I was chosen to solve their problem." The words were simple, stripped of euphemism or mitigation, stating the facts with brutal directness. Henry felt the world tilt around him, his worst suspicion confirmed in a single devastating sentence. "You're saying you're my—" He still couldn't complete the thought. Couldn't use the word father in connection with this enslaved man standing before him. "I'm saying I was used," Marcus said, and now there was an edge in his voice, a carefully controlled anger. "I'm saying your mama had me brought to the main house on specific nights. I'm saying I had no choice in what happened, no power to refuse, no ability to protect myself or claim what resulted from it. I'm saying I watched you be born and then had you taken from me before I could even touch you properly. I'm saying I've spent 15 years working this plantation, watching you grow up believing you're something you're not, forbidden from ever acknowledging what you are to me." The cabin seemed to be shrinking, the air too thick to breathe. Henry grabbed the back of the chair to steady himself, his legs suddenly unreliable. "But that would mean I'm—" Again the words wouldn't come, the truth too large and terrible to speak. "You're my son," Marcus said, and his voice broke on the words. "You're my blood. You carry my father's name, William, as your middle name, though you were never told that. You have my mother's eyes, rest her soul. You have my hands. If you'd look at them closely. You're mine, Henry. You were always mine. even though they stole you and raised you to think you were theirs. Henry looked at his hands, really looked at them for the first time in his life. The shape of the fingers, the particular way his thumb curved, the pattern of veins across the back. And then he looked at Marcus's hands, scarred from decades of woodworking, larger and more calloused, but fundamentally the same structure, the same distinctive characteristics. The resemblance was undeniable once you knew to look for it. "Why didn't you tell me?" Henry asked, and he could hear the desperation in his own voice. "All these years, why didn't you say something?" Marcus laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "Tell you? How exactly was I supposed to do that, boy? Walk up to you in the yard and announce you're my son? That would have gotten me killed or sold away before the words finished leaving my mouth. Your mama made it very clear what would happen if I ever tried to claim you or speak to you about what really happened. She owns me. She owns my life, my body, my very existence. And she made sure I understood that my silence was the price of survival. Not just for me, but for my sister and her children who also live on this place." The full horror of the situation was beginning to penetrate Henry's shock. His mother had done this. His refined, respectable mother had orchestrated the rape of an enslaved man, stolen the resulting child, and then spent 15 years maintaining the deception through threats and power. His father, Thomas, the man who had taught him to ride and shoot and manage an estate, had participated in the scheme, had claimed another man's child as his own, and raised him in deliberate ignorance of the truth. "Does everyone know?" Henry asked. "All the slaves, do they all know what I really am?" Marcus nodded slowly. "They've always known. Secrets like this, they don't stay secret among us. We see everything, know everything that happens in the big house and beyond it. Every slave on this plantation knows you're my son, raised as white. They've watched you grow up on the other side of a line that should never have existed for you. Some pity you. Some resent you for living in luxury while we suffer. Most just see you as another tragedy in a system built on tragedy." Henry felt tears burning in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "What am I supposed to do with this? How am I supposed to go back to that house knowing what I know now?" "I don't know," Marcus said, and his voice was gentler now, touched with something that might have been paternal compassion. "I've thought about this moment for 15 years, imagined 1,000 times what I'd say to you if you ever learned the truth. But I never had a good answer. You can't be white now that you know you're not, but you can't be black either, because the law says you are white, and that's the only protection you have in this world. You're caught between two identities belonging fully to neither, and there's no easy resolution to that." Henry sank into the chair, his legs finally giving out completely. He put his head in his hands, and now the tears did come, silent and overwhelming. Marcus watched him for a moment, then moved closer, one hand hovering uncertainly as if he wanted to offer comfort, but didn't know if he had the right. Finally, carefully, he placed his hand on Henry's shoulder, the first time he had touched his son in 15 years. They stayed like that for a long time, father and son connected by a single point of contact across an unbridgeable divide. Outside, the night sounds of the plantation continued. Insects chirping, a dog barking in the distance, voices calling across the quarters. Inside the cabin, two people who shared blood but not identity tried to make sense of a situation that had no good outcome, only varying degrees of damage and compromise. "I need to know everything," Henry finally said, raising his head to look at Marcus. "I need to know exactly how this happened, what was done to you, how they convinced you or forced you. I need to understand the full truth of where I came from." And so Marcus told him. He described the August afternoon when Eleanor had summoned him and explained what she wanted. He described the impossibility of refusing someone who owned you completely, who could destroy not just your life, but the lives of everyone you cared about with a single command. He described the months of scheduled encounters, the clinical horror of being used as breeding stock, the psychological damage of having intimate relations forced on you while maintaining the pretense of consent. He described watching Eleanor pat her belly and parade around playing pregnant while he worked in remote corners of the plantation, erased from the story even as it was happening. He described the night of Henry's birth, hearing the baby's cries through the cabin walls, being allowed one brief glimpse before being sent away and told never to approach the child. He described 15 years of watching from a distance as his son grew up calling another man father, learning to command enslaved people with casual authority, becoming exactly what the system designed him to be. And he described the particular torture of loving someone you could never claim, of being simultaneously father and stranger, of carrying knowledge that could never be acknowledged without destroying everyone involved. Henry listened to it all, each detail another blow to his understanding of who he was and where he had come from. By the time Marcus finished, the night was deep and still, the rest of the plantation long since asleep. Henry stood slowly, his body feeling ancient despite his 15 years, and moved toward the door. But before he left, he turned back to look at Marcus one more time. "I don't know what I'm going to do," he said. "I don't know if I can pretend I don't know this. But I needed to hear it from you. I needed to know the truth. The truth is a dangerous thing for people like us," Marcus said quietly. "It can set you free or it can destroy you. Sometimes both at once. Whatever you decide to do, be careful. Your mama didn't go to all this trouble to have this secret exposed now. She'll do anything to protect it, including destroying you if she has to." Henry nodded, understanding the warning. He slipped out of the cabin into the darkness, walking back toward the main house like a different person than the one who had left it hours earlier. The boy who had thought he knew who he was had died in that cabin. What was walking back was something new, something undefined. Someone who would have to decide every day what to do with knowledge that could never be unknown, that changed everything while changing nothing at all. Behind him, Marcus stood in his cabin doorway, watching his son disappear into the night, and wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life by telling the truth after 15 years of silence. The days following Henry's conversation with Marcus were among the most difficult of his life. He returned to the main house that night and went through the motions of normalcy with a skill that surprised him. Eating breakfast with Eleanor, discussing plantation business with the recovering Thomas, responding to questions and fulfilling expectations as if nothing fundamental had changed. But everything had changed. Every interaction with his supposed parents now carried the weight of his secret knowledge. Every moment of forced normalcy, another layer of deception he was participating in, rather than merely being subjected to. Eleanor noticed the change in him immediately. She had spent 15 years watching Henry for any sign that might threaten her carefully constructed fiction, and her maternal instincts, however complicated their origins, were finely tuned to his moods and behaviors. She saw the way he looked at her now, with an expression she couldn't quite interpret but that filled her with instinctive dread. She saw how he had become quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours alone in ways that suggested troubling contemplation rather than simple adolescent moodiness. 3 days after Henry's midnight visit to Marcus's cabin, Eleanor cornered him in the library. She closed the door behind her with deliberate care, then stood with her back against it, blocking any easy escape. Her face showed the carefully controlled concern of a mother worried about her child. But beneath it, Henry could now see the calculating vigilance of a woman protecting a dangerous secret. "You've been troubled lately," Eleanor said, her voice gentle but probing. "Something is weighing on you." "I need you to tell me what it is." Henry looked at her. This woman who had raised him, who had nursed him through childhood illnesses, who had taught him to read and write, who had been mother to him in every way except the most fundamental. And he felt a complex mixture of love and betrayal so intense, it was almost physically painful. "I've been thinking about who I am," he said carefully, "about what makes a person who they are. Their blood, their upbringing, their choices." Eleanor's expression flickered, just for a moment, showing fear beneath the maternal concern. "That's a philosophical question many young men grapple with," she said, but her voice had an edge now. "What prompted this particular line of thinking?" Henry could have deflected, could have offered some innocuous explanation, and retreated back into the safety of pretended ignorance. But 15 years of lies had built up inside him, and now that he knew the truth, continuing the deception felt impossible. "I found some letters," he said quietly, "in Father's desk. Letters about unusual circumstances and arrangements that needed to remain secret." The color drained from Eleanor's face, and for a moment she looked genuinely frightened, stripped of the composed mask she usually wore. Then her expression hardened, transforming into something cold and dangerous that Henry had never seen before. "You went through your father's private papers," she said, "and it wasn't a question. You violated his trust and invaded his privacy." "I know what you did," Henry said, and his voice was shaking now despite his efforts to control it. "I know about the midwife, about Father's condition, about Marcus. I know what I am and where I came from. I know you've been lying to me my entire life." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with everything that had been hidden for 15 years, suddenly exposed to light. Eleanor stood frozen, her mind clearly racing through possibilities, calculating responses, searching for some way to contain this catastrophe. When she finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm, as if she had decided on a strategy and committed to it completely. "You understand nothing," she said. "You're a child playing with knowledge too dangerous for you to handle properly. Whatever you think you know, whatever conclusions you've drawn, you need to forget them immediately. For your own sake, for your future, for everything we've built." "How can I forget?" Henry asked, and now the tears were coming again, hot and angry. "How can I go back to believing I'm your son, that I'm white, that I belong in this house when I know the truth? You used him. You raped him, even if the law doesn't call it that. You stole me from him and raised me as something I'm not. And you expect me to just forget that because it's convenient for you?" Eleanor crossed the room in 3 quick steps and slapped him across the face with enough force to snap his head to the side. The shock of it was almost as powerful as the physical pain. Eleanor had never struck him before, had prided herself on raising him without corporal punishment. But now her composure had shattered, revealing the ruthlessness beneath the maternal performance. "You will never speak of this again," she said, her voice low and intense. "Not to me, not to your father, not to anyone. You are Henry Beaumont, heir to this plantation, and that is what you will remain. The alternative is that you become property, enslaved by the very laws that currently protect you. Do you understand what I'm telling you? If the truth about your parentage became known, you would lose everything. Your freedom, your education, your future, all of it would be gone. You would be sold at auction like any other slave, and everything you think makes you who you are would be stripped away." Henry touched his cheek where she had struck him, feeling the heat of the impact. "So you're threatening me now? You'll expose your own secret to destroy me if I don't keep silent?" "I'm explaining reality to you," Eleanor said, her voice returning to something approaching calm. "I've spent 15 years protecting you, raising you, ensuring you had every advantage. I did what I had to do to secure our family's future, and yes, it required difficult choices. But those choices gave you life, gave you opportunity, gave you everything you have. And now you want to throw it all away because you've discovered an uncomfortable truth? That's not courage, Henry. That's childish self-destruction." "What about Marcus?" Henry asked. "What about what you did to him? Does he not deserve any consideration?" Eleanor's expression showed something like pity, mixed with contempt for Henry's naivety. "Marcus is a slave. His purpose is to serve the needs of this family. That's the way the world works, whether you like it or not. I needed a child. He provided the means to create one. That's the end of the transaction. Whatever sentiment you think you owe him is misplaced. He's not your father in any meaningful sense. Thomas raised you, educated you, prepared you to inherit all of this. Blood is just biology. Family is about everything else." Henry looked at her, this woman who had justified the unjustifiable with such casual cruelty, and felt something fundamental break inside him. "You're a monster," he said quietly. "You've done monstrous things and convinced yourself they were necessary. And you want me to become that same kind of monster, to accept what you did, to participate in the lie, to help you maintain this evil system." Eleanor's face showed genuine pain at his words, perhaps the first authentic emotion she had displayed during the entire confrontation. "I'm a woman who refused to accept defeat," she said. "I'm someone who understood that power requires difficult choices." "You think I wanted to do what I did? You think I enjoyed any part of it? I did what was necessary to survive in a world that gives women very few options for securing their futures. Judge me if you want, but you're alive because I was willing to do what you now call monstrous." "I wish I wasn't," Henry said, and the words came out before he could stop them. "I wish I'd never been born if this is what it cost." The declaration hung in the air between them, and for a moment Eleanor looked genuinely stricken, as if Henry had wounded her in a way her own conscience never could. But she recovered quickly, her face closing off again, resuming the mask of cold control. "You don't mean that." "You're upset, and you're saying things designed to hurt me. But you'll come to understand eventually that I gave you a gift. I gave you whiteness, freedom, opportunity. Without me, you would have been born a slave, property to be bought and sold. Instead, you're heir to one of Louisiana's finest plantations. That's worth any cost, any compromise, any moral complexity. Henry shook his head slowly. You didn't give me anything except lies and stolen identity. Everything I am is built on a foundation of rape and theft and deception. How am I supposed to live with that? How am I supposed to accept being master of people who are more truly my family than you or Thomas ever were? The same way everyone in our position lives with it, Eleanor said bluntly. By understanding that the system exists whether we participate in it or not. By recognizing that individual moral purity is a luxury we can't afford. By accepting that the world is built on compromises and that refusing to participate doesn't make you noble, it just makes you irrelevant. The conversation continued for another hour, circling the same impossible terrain. Eleanor alternated between threats and appeals to sentiment, trying to find some approach that would secure Henry's silence and cooperation. Henry oscillated between anger and grief, unable to reconcile his love for the woman who had raised him with his horror at what she had done. They reached no resolution because no resolution was possible. The situation was fundamentally irreconcilable, built on a foundation too corrupted to support any stable structure. When Henry finally left the library, both he and Eleanor understood that their relationship had been permanently altered. The uncomplicated affection of childhood was gone, replaced by something more complex and painful. Eleanor had revealed herself as capable of justifying any cruelty in service of her goals. Henry had discovered that his entire identity was a fiction maintained through violence and coercion. Neither could pretend otherwise anymore. Over the following weeks, Henry's internal crisis deepened. He avoided both Eleanor and Thomas as much as possible, spending his time riding the plantation's boundaries or sitting alone in his room, trying to make sense of an impossible situation. He visited Marcus twice more, late-night conversations where they tried to build some kind of relationship despite the years of enforced separation and the vast gulf of experience that divided them. Marcus told him stories about his family, about Henry's grandparents and great-grandparents, giving him the ancestral context he had been denied. But these conversations were bittersweet, highlighting everything Henry had lost while simultaneously making it clear that it could never be truly recovered. The question that haunted Henry most persistently was what he should do with his knowledge. He had several options, none of them good. He could publicly expose the truth, declare his real parentage, and accept the consequences. But as Eleanor had brutally explained, those consequences would be devastating. Louisiana law was clear on the subject of mixed-race children. Any person with even one black great-grandparent was considered black, subject to enslavement if they couldn't prove free status. Henry had no documentation of freedom, no legal standing except as the supposed son of Thomas Beaumont. Exposing the truth would mean immediate enslavement, likely being sold away from Bellerive to prevent contamination of the family's reputation. He could run away, escape to the north where slavery was illegal and where he might be able to live openly as a person of mixed race. But the war had made travel dangerous and unpredictable. Federal troops occupied parts of Louisiana, Confederate forces controlled others, and the region between was lawless chaos. A 15-year-old with no money, no connections, and ambiguous racial identity would be vulnerable to capture, conscription, or worse. And running would mean abandoning Marcus, leaving him to face whatever retribution Eleanor might impose. Or Henry could do what Eleanor demanded, continue living the lie, accept his position as heir to Bellerive, become the master of enslaved people including his own father. This option promised security, comfort, continuation of everything he had known. But it also meant participating in the very system that had created him through violence and theft. It meant becoming complicit in the ongoing horror of slavery, enforcing a hierarchy that marked people who shared his blood as inferior and subject to his will. The choice was impossible because all the options were unbearable. And so Henry drifted through those summer months of 1862 in a state of moral paralysis, unable to commit to any course of action, unable to reconcile the competing truths of his existence. The resolution, when it came, arrived not through Henry's choice but through the chaos of war. In September, federal troops reached the area around Bellerive as part of their campaign to control the Mississippi River. The plantation was occupied by Union soldiers who commandeered supplies, confiscated cotton, and made it clear that the old order was collapsing. Thomas, still weakened from his earlier illness, collapsed entirely under the stress. He died in October, possibly from heart failure, possibly from the accumulated effects of years of alcohol abuse, possibly from simple despair at watching everything he had built crumbling around him. Eleanor tried to maintain control in the wake of Thomas's death, but the occupation made it impossible. The enslaved people at Bellerive, sensing opportunity in the chaos, began simply walking away, claiming their freedom before it was officially granted. Marcus was among the first to leave, departing without fanfare, taking nothing but a few tools and the clothes he wore. He stopped briefly at the main house before leaving, hoping to say goodbye to Henry. But Eleanor had him turned away by the remaining overseers before he could reach the door. Henry, now 16 and nominally the master of a collapsing plantation, watched the exodus with complex emotions. Each departure was both a personal loss and a vindication, evidence that the system he had been raised to inherit was built on foundations too rotten to sustain. When the Union officer in charge informed Eleanor that all slaves in the occupied territories were now considered free under the Confiscation Acts, she collapsed entirely, the 15 years of careful control finally giving way to hysteria and grief. The final confrontation between Henry and Eleanor came in November, after most of the enslaved people had left and it became clear that Bellerive as they had known it was finished. Eleanor had been drinking, something Henry had never seen her do before, and her usual careful composure was entirely absent. She raged at him about betrayal and ingratitude, about how she had sacrificed everything to give him a future that he was now throwing away through weakness and misplaced sentiment. "I created you," she screamed, her voice raw and broken. "I made you out of nothing, out of desperation and will. And now you stand there judging me, looking at me like I'm some kind of monster, when everything you are exists because I had the courage to do what was necessary." Henry looked at her, this woman who had shaped his entire existence through lies and violence, and felt a strange mixture of pity and revulsion. "You didn't create me," he said quietly. "You stole me. You took a child who should have been born free, or at least born to his real parents, and you twisted him into something false. You call it courage. I call it evil. And the fact that you still can't see the difference is the most damning thing about you." Eleanor struck him again, but this time Henry caught her wrist before the blow could land. They stood frozen like that for a moment, mother and son locked in physical struggle that represented the larger battle between them. Then Eleanor collapsed, sobbing, all her strength finally depleted. Henry released her and stepped back, watching her break down with no idea how to comfort her and no desire to try. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor asked when she could speak again. "Now that everything is ruined, now that you've gotten what you wanted, what are you going to do with your precious truth?" "I'm going to leave," Henry said, the decision forming as he spoke it. "I'm going to find Marcus if I can. I'm going to try to figure out who I actually am, not who you made me pretend to be. And I'm going to let you keep your secret, not because I forgive you, but because exposing it now would only hurt people who've already suffered enough." He left Bellerive the next morning, taking a horse and enough supplies to reach New Orleans. Eleanor didn't try to stop him, didn't even come out of her room to say goodbye. Henry rode away from the only home he had ever known, looking back once at the white columns and manicured grounds that represented everything he was supposed to inherit, everything that had been built on lies and maintained through cruelty. He found Marcus in New Orleans 3 weeks later, living in a freedman's camp working as a carpenter for Union reconstruction efforts. Their reunion was awkward, neither of them quite knowing how to bridge 15 years of forced separation, but they tried, slowly building something that might eventually become a real relationship. Marcus introduced Henry to his sister and her children, to the extended family Henry had never known existed. And Henry began the long, difficult process of learning to be someone other than the fiction Eleanor had created. The war ended. Slavery was abolished, and the world Eleanor and Thomas had built their lives around collapsed entirely. Bellerive was eventually sold to pay debts and taxes, the land divided among smaller farmers, the grand house falling into disrepair. Eleanor lived until 1873, dying alone in a rented room in Baton Rouge, maintained by charity from distant relatives who knew nothing of her secrets. She never saw Henry again after he left, never knew what became of the son she had stolen and raised and ultimately lost. Henry himself struggled for years with questions of identity and belonging. He lived sometimes as white, sometimes as mixed race, depending on circumstances and opportunity. He married a black woman in 1870, a teacher at a freedmen's school, and they had 4 children whom Henry raised to know their full heritage. All of it, the white planter ancestors and the enslaved ones, the wealth and the violence, the lies and the truth. He never fully reconciled the competing parts of his identity, never found a comfortable resolution to the question of who he really was. But he tried to live with honesty in a way his mother never had, to acknowledge complexity rather than bury it beneath carefully constructed fictions. Marcus died in 1880 at 57, his body worn out from decades of hard labor. Henry sat with him during his final illness, holding the hand that shared his own distinctive shape, grieving for all the years they had been denied, for all the relationship they might have had if not for Eleanor's desperate scheme. In his will, Marcus left Henry his carpenter's tools, the same tools he had used to build furniture for the Beaumont main house, including the cradle that had held Henry as an infant. Henry kept those tools for the rest of his life, never using them but maintaining them carefully, polishing the handles smooth from his father's grip, preserving them as evidence of connection that had survived despite everything designed to destroy it. The story of what really happened at Bellerive, of how Eleanor had conceived her plan and executed it and maintained it through 15 years of lies, remained mostly hidden. A few people knew fragments of the truth, but most took their knowledge to their graves. The official family history recorded that Eleanor and Thomas Beaumont had one son, Henry, who had disappointed them by abandoning his inheritance and essentially vanishing into the chaos of Reconstruction. The darker truth, the violence and violation and stolen identity that lay beneath that simple narrative, was buried with the letters that Henry eventually burned, with the memories of enslaved people whose testimony was never recorded, with Eleanor's secrets that she guarded until her final breath. But secrets don't die just because they're hidden. They persist in the blood that carries memory forward, in the DNA that preserves truth even when documents have been destroyed. They echo in the faces of descendants who show unexpected features, in family stories that don't quite add up, in the carefully worded gaps in official records. The horror of what Eleanor did to Marcus, the tragedy of Henry's stolen identity, the systematic cruelty of a system that made such violations possible and even logical, these things remain embedded in American history, whether we acknowledge them or not. Henry Beaumont died in 1910, at 63, having lived long enough to see the beginning of a new century, but never quite escaping the circumstances of his birth. His children and grandchildren carried forward the complexity of his heritage, some passing as white, others claiming their full mixed ancestry, all of them shaped by a foundational trauma they could acknowledge but never fully resolve. The plantation that should have been Henry's inheritance became a historical footnote. The grand house eventually demolished. The land returned to cotton cultivation under different ownership. Nothing remains of Bellerive now except a historical marker and some old property records. There is no mention of Eleanor's scheme, no acknowledgement of Marcus's violation, no recognition of Henry's stolen identity. The official history is sanitized, comfortable, carefully edited to remove the parts that would make modern audiences uncomfortable. But the truth persists anyway, in the genes passed down through generations, in the stories whispered among family members, in the fundamental understanding that American history is built on such violations, on such thefts, on such carefully maintained lies that destroyed everyone they touched. What do you think? Could Henry have made different choices that might have led to a better outcome? Was Eleanor simply a product of her time and circumstances, or do her actions transcend any possible justification? How many other families carry similar secrets buried beneath generations of silence and carefully constructed fictions? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story revealed something about the hidden darkness of plantation society that you've never encountered before, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand that the comfortable narratives of history often conceal horrors too disturbing to acknowledge. Subscribe to The Sealed Room for more stories that uncover the truth buried beneath America's most carefully guarded secrets. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we reveal the next dark chapter of our hidden history. Until next time, remember, some lies are so fundamental they shape not just individual lives but entire societies. And the truth, when it finally emerges, forces us to confront who we really are and what we're really built on.